All right, well, in today's video, I want to talk a little bit about the value that internal audit is providing in about independence. Now, I know most people in internal audit, we like to believe that we are adding value to our organization. In fact, that's one of the things that we talk about all the time, right? We're an independent and objective assurance function that adds value to the organization. And but as I got thinking about this, I want to ask some questions, and that's what I'm going to talk about today in this video. So again, I know that we like to believe that we are adding value, but if we look at this from a critical thinking standpoint and start to look at some of the other data, the question is, are we really adding value or are we not? Right? Because if we look at some other things as kind of proxies and look at it critically, and as opposed to wanting to believe something that the data does not support, right? Let's look at this kind of in a critical way, and so that's what we're going to talk about today. And so I want to use the idea of budgets because this is something that I hear often from chief audit executives. They say things like, well, I don't have budget for that. Oh, I have to go ask for approval for that. Okay. And I hear that so often that it started me thinking, right? Well, if we're adding so much value, then why does internal audit have such a tight budget? And if we're adding so much value, why are internal audit budgets being cut? And I just had this last week from a CAE who said that he had significant budget cuts. Now, the word significant, right? Significant budget cuts is not a good sign or not something you want to hear if you are a chief audit executive. So let's go through and talk about this a little bit. And I'm also going to provide, some context and some tips if you're someone who finds yourself in this situation where maybe you have some tight budget or you're being asked to cut your budget, some things that you can do to be able to show the value, keep your budgets, and go from there. Okay, now, to begin with, before I start talking about budgets, because I know sometimes this happens in organizations where, let's say, for example, the organization just decides that they're going to do 10% budget cuts across the whole organization. And so, somebody would come to the CAE and say, look, we're doing 10% budget cuts. We need you to cut 10% of your budget. So if everyone in the organization is cutting their budget, this isn't what I'm talking about, right? That's a CAE stepping up and doing, their part in helping to kind of meet that organization objective. Okay. And so I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about these issues where maybe internal audit is being asked to cut budgets. Maybe some admin functions are being asked to cut budget, but other people are not. Okay. And because that kind of becomes the distinction, right? If everybody has to do it, then everybody is in the same boat. But if only internal audit is asked to do it, or if only admin or cost centers are asked to do it, but the cuts are not elsewhere in the organization, then it starts to make you question whether or not these admin functions, including internal audit, are really adding value, right? Because here's the reality, and you can believe me or don't believe me, it's up to you. But when companies are struggling, let's say, okay, that they're struggling financially, one of the first things that executives will do is cut budgets, right? Because they're trying to conserve cash, they're trying to reduce their expenses to turn things around. And often those cuts will come in the administrative or what are called overhead kind of functions. But they don't cut marketing, they don't cut sales. In fact, a lot of times when companies are struggling, they invest a tremendous amount of money in sales and in marketing things like advertising, hiring more salespeople, because they realize, right, that without those sales, the company does not exist. And so most of the time, when people are in sales, when people are in marketing, they don't have their budgets cut. Okay. And that's just a reality because the organization values those functions and realizes how integral they are to the business at large. Okay. So we know that that happens most of the time. So why do the admin and overhead areas, including internal audit, why are they the ones being asked to cut? Because the executives and the board don't feel like those parts of the organization are really carrying their own weight. They're not really adding value. And so they want them to cut back the expenses and really kind of do as little as possible in those particular areas. So if you find yourself in that situation, it means that your executives don't actually believe that maybe you add as much value as you think you do. Okay. Now, there's different reasons why that can be. And for each organization, it's going to be different. Right. And so, again, I'm just going to talk in some generalities here. If you have specific questions, leave comments here or shoot me a message and we can talk about it, your particular situation in more detail. Okay. But as I said, what is happening is for some reason your executives don't think you add as much value as you think that you do. Okay. Now, again, that could be from a lot of different reasons. There could be a perception that, well, you're just a cost center, you're just an overhead function, you're just another compliance function. And if we need to make cuts, we're going to cut back there and try to do as little as possible and hope that we get by. Right. And sometimes, again, that's a decision that ends up being made. Sometimes it may be that they don't see what you're doing is valuable. And I'll give you an example is that often the audit projects that I see people doing are things that as an executive, I would question their value as well. And so, again, just in generalities, let's say that, internal audit goes and does a project and we find some control that's not working, or we find some area of non-compliance, and we come back all excited to the executives and we say, hey, we've got this recommendation, or here's a finding, we need to do these things different. And when we look at it and we start looking at the effect, right? Because again, if you think of the 5 C's, criteria, condition, cause, consequence, and corrective action plan, that we often do our recommendations or findings in, maybe the consequence is $100,000. Okay. And so we look at it and we're pretty proud of ourselves because, we found an area maybe where there's $100,000 issue, $100,000 risk. And so we're all excited. We go to the executives, we explain this to them. And the executive sitting across the table from us is looking at us and something like this is going through their mind. Wow, internal audit, you found $100,000. Well, I have a $25 million issue over here that I'm dealing with that you're not helping me with. So I hear what you're saying, but $100,000 is not 25 million. Okay. And some of the reason for that is, again, that we're not actually taking a risk-based approach like we should be. We're not actually focusing on those big value items that our executives are concerned about, that our executives are trying to fix. And so, that can be one of the reasons why you may be having trouble getting budget, why maybe your executives don't feel like you add as much value as you think you do. Okay. And I use those numbers because a lot of times that's about the magnitude difference in some of the findings and things that I see internal audit doing. And from an executive standpoint, I can totally understand why they may think otherwise. Okay. So that's one issue. And again, for each of you that's listening, uh, the answer may be different. But the moral of the story is, if you're seeing those things happen, it's really up to the chief audit executive to find out why. Find out if there's a perception issue, find out what is going on that is making it so that the value that your executives see is not the same as what you are. And then again, finding out what that is, coming up with a strategy and some tactics to be able to go after and fix that issue, right? Because if you don't fix the issue, you're going to be constantly fighting for budget, and that's going to have a negative impact on your organization as a whole. Okay. Now, so this is again where if we start to look at things and we say, well, now just a minute, we think we're adding value, but our budgets are being cut. That's a point when you should start critically thinking, right? Of saying, well, now hold it just a minute. I thought this was the case. Maybe it's not. Maybe I should go in and do some more research, collect some data, look at this from a critical standpoint and see if what I'm believing is really true. And again, this is where those critical thinking skills that unfortunately are missing in a lot of internal audit. Now, you may be saying, well, no, I have perfectly great critical thinking skills. Well, about 60% of chief audit executives said that people on their team and people that they're hiring don't have good critical thinking skills, and they need to improve there. So maybe you do, maybe you don't, I don't know. But when the results come back that high, it's something that you really should start to question. Now, let's take a look at this and think about budget cuts from a standpoint of independence, okay? Because again, most internal auditors like to pride themselves on being independent, okay? And again, are we really independent? If we look at things like budget cuts, maybe we're not as independent as we thought we were, right? Sure, you can put whatever you want on your audit plan, but if I don't give you any budget, if I don't give you people to do those projects, are you really independent, right? Now, I'm going to share a story with you here, and this goes back several years. But there was an organization that I was familiar with, was working with, and here's kind of what happened. Okay, they were experiencing some financial troubles, some short-term financial troubles. They were not meeting the street expectations. And so a new management team came in to turn things around, right? To shake things up, to get the numbers back where they needed to go. And so I remember, talking with the chief audit executive, and this is one of the things that this company implemented. They said, all right, effective immediately, no one in the organization can travel without the approval of the chief financial officer. So for anybody to travel, the CFO had to approve that travel. Now, if you were the chief audit executive at that organization and you start thinking about this, does that affect your independence? The answer is yes, that would affect your independence. Why? Because you may have a training budget, but you can't send your team out to do training, to do the audits unless they were on site, right? And again, this is pre-pandemic. This was before, when auditors used to go out into the field much more than they are today. But it begs the question, right? Is, again, at that point, is internal audit really independent if they have to get approval and kind of come in begging on their hands and knees to the CFO to be able to send their people to locations to do audits? So again, you can put whatever you want on the audit plan, but if you don't have the resources to be able to fulfill that audit plan, are you really independent? Okay. And I know I've talked about this before, where I think independence is one of those issues where internal audit likes to believe that we're independent because we want to believe that we're independent. But the facts show something else. And when you critically think about it and look at it, and budgets are one of the ways this happens. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more about here. There's other ways that this happens as well, right? Again, your independence. Well, a lot of chief audit executives will say, well, I report to the board functionally. Yeah, but who do you report to administratively? Well, the CFO or the CEO. Okay. Who does your annual performance evaluation? CFO, CEO. Who determines your compensation? CEO, CFO, whoever the admin reporting person is. Who tells you whether you can take vacation or not? Right? And again, ultimately, those questions end up leading to an answer of whoever is administrative reporting. And so while, quote unquote, functionally, you may report to the board, all of the control is still in the hands of the executives, right? And so you're not independent. At the end of the day, who pays you your salary? The organization, right? So you're not independent of the organization, okay? You may be objective in doing assurance projects on areas within the organization because you don't have responsibility for it. And yes, you're objective, but you're not necessarily independent. Okay. Now, another thing about budgets that I end up seeing often, and again, just for your consideration, for you to think about, but I see this happen a lot too, where a budget gets approved, right? The CAE comes in, they do the budget for this next year. It includes, excuse me, it includes, an amount for payroll and benefits and, some of the administrative things that you have to pay for. Usually includes training, professional services, maybe, for outsourcing or co-sourcing arrangements. There's some different things that end up in the budget. And so what happens, the CAE puts together the budget and it gets approved by the executives. It gets approved by the board, let's say, because often it does get approved by the board as well, or at least they're aware of it. And then here's what happens is, let's say that, again, I'm a CAE, I've got, 50 people in my group, 40 people, and I have $100,000 training budget. I have $100,000 line item in my budget to use for training. Okay. So I have been approved for that. But what I see is kind of a secondary approval that happens in a lot of organizations. And so, again, I look at it as an executive standpoint and would say, look, I have a $100,000 budget. It's been approved. I'm going to pay for whatever courses I want for my people. I don't have to ask anybody's approval because it's already been approved in the budget, right? But what happens so much of the time is, even though you have a line item for whatever it might be, say it's training, say it's professional services, okay, it doesn't matter. What I see in a lot of organizations is, even though the budget is approved, the CAE has to go and ask for a second permission from the executives. Now, is that really independent? I don't think so, but I see that happening all the time. And again, a lot of people would say, well, that's just good cost control to make sure that, we're not spending anything that we're not supposed to. Well, that's what people might tell you, but is that actually really what's going on? Is it really a good cost control, or is it a way, right, to impair your independence in the organization and to, in a way, kind of direct what work, what training, what other things you might do? It's also kind of another sneaky trick to not to come in under budget. Okay. And so I'm going to peel the curtain a little bit on some executive tricks here. One of them is, you get all this stuff approved in your budget, and then you don't spend in the line items that you say you were going to spend them on. And instead, you end up kind of switching things out. And so, as an example, CFO could say, "Oh yeah, internal audit, you have $100,000 in training budget, but I need to approve any training that your group wants to have done." Okay, and if the answer is no, most of the time, and so you get to the end of the year, and yes, you had $100,000 in training budget, but they only approved 25,000. What does that show you again about their perceived value of internal audit? But also it may be a trick for them to be able to use that 75,000 somewhere else under their budget control. Because if they're not spending it with you, but they're spending it with somebody else, that means that they value that other person more than they do internal audit. Now, I kind of set the stage here. And again, don't want to leave you, feeling, oh my goodness, what's going on here? But I want to be, open and honest with you, because I think a lot of people in our profession like to sugarcoat everything and want you to say, oh, no, it's okay to believe that, right? Because that's what we all believe. Well, but again, are you critically thinking about it? And is that actually what is happening when we start looking at data and when we start asking some of the hard questions that maybe we don't want to ask? Now, if you find yourself in this situation where you have tight budgets, maybe you have this secondary approval that's going on, maybe you're being asked to cut budgets and nobody else is, what do you do, right? What do you do? So I want to talk a few minutes about that to make sure that, again, if you find yourself in this situation, here are some things that you can do. Now, one thing is the way in which you kind of track or show the value that you are providing. Now, a lot of people, a lot of CAEs will use certain metrics like how many hours you worked, sometimes even utilization, how utilized your people were, how many projects you did last year compared to the one before. If that's the only way that you're tracking your progress and the value that you're adding to the organization, and that's all you're reporting, that's not a very convincing sale, okay? Some other ways that people may do it is they may look at it and say, well, it's, compliance related. Let's say, well, we found out that, in this instance that if, and I'll give you an example from my career, right, where we went in and we were doing, it was the payroll related audit, but it was more about, we found that there were certain government documents that we were required to have for each employee. And, if we didn't have evidence of those in their file, and the government came in and audited our employee records, they could fine us. They could give us what was called a paperwork violation, which means for every one of these forms that's not in the employee's file, they could charge us a certain amount. And I can't remember what it was exactly, $50, $100. It didn't seem like a lot of money, but when you had 11,000 employees, and the work that we had done showed a certain error percentage in the population, meaning, there could have been up to, I don't remember what the numbers were, so I'm going to make them up because it was a long time ago, but something like 20% of the employee files probably didn't have this document. So we could go back and we could actually calculate kind of a cost avoidance and say, look, based on our, and this was the statistical sample that was done in the old days, because you had to actually physically open up people's files and see that the document was in there, that if that was the true rate, which we believed it was because it was statistically valid, that if the government came in and did the same sort of audit that we just did, the company could be fined anywhere between, I remember the end numbers, $1 million to $3 million. was what the estimate was. If the government came in, found the same results, they would send us a bill for anywhere between $1 million to $3 million. Okay. That's an example of cost avoidance. Okay. And so a cost avoidance sort of thing is, look, I just helped you miss a potential risk. I helped you avoid a potential risk before it even happened, right? And so that's cost avoidance. Now, another way of looking at it is cost savings. And so again, I'll give you an example of that. Our internal or our external auditors came to us one year and they wanted to raise our rates. I think it was about 20% in 1 year. Ouch, right? So we negotiated and we worked with them and we said, look, if internal audit will do this kind of manual testing that we would normally have to do as part of our audit, if internal audit will do this, we'll only raise your rates 10% instead of 20%. Okay. So we looked at the numbers and we looked at how much time it would take on someone on my team to be able to do the work that they were suggesting. And it was a good idea for us to do the work, because effectively it would only take maybe 3 to 5 months of one person's time on my team to do this work, but it would save us about 2 years of that person's salary. Okay, so for us, it was a good investment, right? Yeah, we'll do it. We'll invest in internal audit. We'll invest in even another headcount if we need to, because the cost savings is greater than what it is, right? And so I could use that as a way to help justify the value that I was bringing to the organization. Cost savings, cost avoidance, right, are two different ways for you to look at this. Now, if you're not using one or both of those to be able to, identify or figure out, hey, we just helped the company avoid this potential risk impact, then you're not doing yourself justice of actually showing the true value that you're adding to the organization. Now, I'll tell you another story, right? Because again, a lot of CAEs are looking at things like cost savings, okay? And yes, that's a good way to be able to show our value in the cost savings. They're usually easier numbers to calculate, right? Like my example in the external audit fees. But cost avoidance is often a much better way of looking at this, okay? And, again, happy to share more about this with people's individual circumstances as well, to kind of explain how this would actually work in your scenario. Today, I just want to give you some generalities. But I also want to share with you, when in the Audit Leader Forum that I facilitate, we were having a discussion on one of the calls. And one CAE was bringing up, we were talking about the value that we were adding. And she was talking about, cost savings and how she was, calculating all these ways that she was saving the organization money. And one of the other CAs on the call kind of raised his hand and said, you're only talking about cost savings. What if you considered cost avoidance? And she kind of sat with that for a little bit and she went, you know what? I think you're right. And so she started going back and looking at some of the cost avoidance things that were happening. And what ended up happening to her is one of the things that happens to a lot of organizations, which is, CFO comes along and says, hey, CAE, I need you to cut your budget. And she turned around and said, I'm not going to cut my budget. And the CFO said, why not? And she said, because on the last project, we helped you avoid $400,000 or I think it was $450,000 that we helped you avoid based on our last audit. And so that value that we provided to the organization is more than you're asking me to take in a budget cut. So forget it. I'm not going to do the budget cut. So she pushed back on the CFO. She actually showed, right, the value that she was providing that probably the CFO had forgotten about, but she stood her ground. And by showing that cost avoidance, guess what? The CFO backed off. She didn't have to cut her budgets, right? Now, most CAEs would just take it. They'd say, oh my goodness, all right, okay, I'll do it, right? But she was prepared. She knew the value that her department was providing to the organization, both based on cost savings and cost avoidance. She knew those numbers. She could prove those numbers. She could show those numbers to the CFO. And as I said, at the end of the day, the CFO backed off and went looking for budget cuts somewhere else. So if you're in this kind of a situation where you have tight budgets, or again, maybe you have, this stupid double approval thing. I never put up with a double approval thing when I was a CAE. If I had the budget, I would go and spend it because I beg for forgiveness instead of asking for permission. I've already asked for permission in my budget. You've already given me permission. So I'm going to use it and I'm going to spend it in the way that I see fit as an executive running this particular function. And so again, there's a lot of people that I talk to that are like, oh, I got to go check with the CFO. Well, do you really need to go check with the CFO, or is this a decision you can actually make on your own? If you already have budget for it, why do you need to go ask for a second approval? It's much easier to just do it. And then if there's a question afterwards, then you have the question, right? And again, if it's already been approved, don't buy into this is just good cost controls. That's not what it is, right? When people are asking you to do a double and triple approval on expenses, what they're actually doing is taking away your independence and guiding you in exactly what you can and can't do under the guise of being good controls, which is not. Okay. So anyway, that's a little bit today, about the value that an internal audit is providing. And so again, just ask yourself the question, if you're an audit leader, I'm sure that you do good work. I'm sure that you believe that you are adding value, but are the things that are happening to you, do you have tight budgets? Are you not allowed to hire new people? Are you asked to have your budget cut? And there could be other things as well. But if some of these other things are happening, I just encourage you to think critically about it and try to understand what's really behind and what's really going on here. And then figure out how you can fix it, right? And again, it can be done. I've been coaching CAEs now for 12 or 13 years on how to actually navigate through some of these corporate politics. It can be done, right? So just letting you know, okay, it can be done. There's plenty of examples of it. And I've been pretty successful in my own career at doing it as well. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and sign off for today because I went past the 30-minute mark. But thanks for listening to this entire video, and I will see you on the next video.